What's going on, everybody? We got Jamey Vinnick back here again for year three, third straight year. Miami has landed a player from Washington State. Jamey covers Washington State, does a great job for KookFan.com and the 24/7 network. Jamey, how are you?
I'm good. How about you?
Good. Let's get into it. Ethan O'Connor, the cornerback out of Washington State, a redshirt freshman, had a good year statistically, some analytic stuff, which we will get into. And then also, is Ethan O'Connor poised for a breakout year in 2025? We'll kind of talk about that too. But overall impressions of Ethan as a player from this past season.
Yeah, so he was kind of a guy that was in the mix to be the number two corner throughout most of spring ball and then fall camp. Jamori Colson, who was supposed to probably be the number two guy, be the starter, he gets hurt, has a couple of injuries in fall camp. O'Connor takes over the spot, and he never relinquished it. I mean, he was the guy for them all year in that spot. You honestly probably could say midway through the year, he became their number one cornerback. Stephen Hall, who's now at Missouri, was a good corner as well, the Holiday Bowl notwithstanding. But O'Connor was the guy who he was a playmaker. He had a bunch of really big plays. He had a lot of interceptions. He had some timely interceptions. His tackling was good. He was a very sound player, and you saw why he was recruited so heavily out of high school, why he had offers from Alabama and Georgia and Washington and so on. And you certainly saw that player. There's still some raw. Some stuff that's got to get ironed out. He can get a little grabby. He actually got called, I think, 3 times for face mask penalties. Not on tackles, but in coverage. He's trying to get his hands, in the right spot. He's trying to make that initial contact. He misses. He gets a face mask. Early in the season, he'd have maybe some breakdowns with some of the zone schemes. He'd release when he shouldn't release, or so on. You'd see him every now and then, like any corner, he would get beat on a deep route. But as the season went on, those instances became very, very, very rare. I mean, by the end of the year, and I mean, I would say if there was a full Pac-12, all Pac-12 teams with, X amount of players, he would have been an all-conference cornerback, I think, without question. So it's a really good get for Miami. It's just there are still some things that he has got to do to take his game to the next level, and part of that is he's got to get bigger. He's really, really wiry, really thin. Obviously, you don't want to have too much bulk as a corner, but as he starts to get into some of the bigger receivers, you start facing guys who are 6'3", 200 pounds, 225 pounds. Yeah, that's where I kind of am curious how he'll be able to match up against those guys. He didn't have to face a lot of them this year, just the way Washington State's schedule worked out, but that's a little bit of a concern, I would say, for me, is how can he match up against the more physical receivers right now?
Jamey, you touched on something there from his recruiting background. He was a 3-star recruit from 24/7 Sports. But those offers came in, as you mentioned, Alabama, Georgia, LSU, I saw USC as well, out of Los Alamitos, California, there in Southern California. I'm curious what you make of what you saw from him in high school, what you knew about him then, and then he goes to Washington State that first year, red shirts, and then this past year as a redshirt freshman had this year, as you mentioned, played a lot of snaps, and as essentially was out there all the time looking at his numbers there. What do you make of his progress? How he got to this point? I know you touched on the improvement he still has to make, but what do you think led to him getting to the point that he's at right now from when he left high school?
I think he checked his attitude, and that's him saying that. That's not me, saying anything to that. He was a kid who, again, coming out, he had all these offers, and he was signed. He was going to UCLA, and he didn't have the grades to get into UCLA. It ended up being an academic issue, and he had to kind of change course, and ended up at Washington State. I'm just quoting him. This is exactly what he told me. He said he got to Washington State and he had an attitude. He thought he was better than Washington State. I mean, he was a UCLA guy. He's better than all these guys. And he quickly realized that that wasn't true. And part of that was Washington State had a lot of talented corners on the roster. I mean, they had their starting cornerbacks for the bulk of last year are both in the NFL, Shaw Smith-Wade and Cam Lampkin. Then you add in Stephen Hall, who's now going to the SEC. You add in Jamori Colson, who was a solid corner. He expected to come in and take over the world. That's not what happened. And I think this year he matured a lot. And the biggest thing I would say, and this is kind of the duality of maybe where his maturity was. When I first talked to him after he committed, he said that him leaving UCLA was his own choice. Yeah, it wasn't a good fit for me, this or that. When I talked to him again in the fall, this past fall, he was very open about the academic struggles, et cetera. So I think when he first commits, he doesn't want to pretend like it was UCLA's choice. It was his choice. Oh, I'm still the man. When you talk to him after this fall, he certainly had taken some maturity or maturation. And I think the Wazoo coaches challenged him. I mean, he said the defensive tackles coach, Pete Caligas, called him a fraud in the spring. And that ticked him off because he didn't want to be a fraud. But I think last year was a really good reality check for him. I think it humbled him a lot. And I think that maybe helped propel him to this year where he had to realize, I was the man in high school. I had all this talent. That's great. I still have to work. And I think, credit to the Washington State coaches. They brought a lot of that out of him. And then credit to him as an individual kind of taking those steps and maturing in his mental side of the game. And I think as a result of that, he was able to get on the field and able to be very productive. Whereas, last year, he said he would make a mistake in practice. He'd get beat in practice, and that would ruin the week for him. He'd be so mad at himself for the mistake. How could I let this happen? These guys aren't good enough to beat me. Whereas now, as he took it as kind of a learning, and he kind of understood more of, this is what I need to be. This is what I am. I can't pretend I'm still the UCLA guy. And again, as I quote, he said, I didn't want Washington State, but I needed Washington State. So I think the last 2 years have been good for him. I would just say I hope that he's matured enough to where now going to a bigger school, or much bigger school, a much bigger program, Power Four again, he can still keep that same modesty and that same work ethic that he had at Washington State.
Yeah, that's obviously great insight, Jamey. That's why I like always talking to you and gathering this kind of information. That this is great. One of the things when any type of player transfers into a program, I'm doing a crash course, trying to learn as much as I can about them. And one of the things I did was, watching his interviews, and I watched his interceptions. He had 4 interceptions last year. I saw all 4 of them. I thought they were impressive, but there was one that stood out to me. The Fresno State one late in the game, essentially the pick 6. And I thought what stood out to me was his interview talking about that play and how he, felt like he did a lot of studying leading up to the play and told his teammates. But here he is. We're going to listen to him, Jamey, as Ethan talks about this interception, which stood out to me here.
No, I was ready for it. Like I told, it's crazy because I literally told Kenny Worthy, he's my roommate for when we travel, and I was like, bro, I'm gonna get a pick, and it's gonna be during like this exact play. Like I was telling all of them, like it's gonna be exact play, and I promise you I'm gonna jump in and take it to the house. And that's just what happened. You just gotta speak stuff into existence sometimes, to be honest.
So there, I thought it was impressive with what he said, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the maturation. I mean, certainly to have that mindset, and the other interceptions against Texas Tech and Oregon State too were good, as some balls kind of sailed there too. But what did you kind of make of his interceptions, his playmaking ability, and then hearing him say that his essentially his studying, his film work, kind of led to part of his success certainly in that game, and I assume that's kind of how he felt all year long.
Yeah, I think he did a really good job picking up on the route trees that opponents were going to run. And I think you saw that against Fresno State where, as he said, they had run kind of that hitch or whatever the route was. They'd run that earlier and it had worked. So they go back to it and he's ready for it. And that's where the God-given ability, the instincts, the stuff that you can't teach, that's where he has that. And that's where you look at a play like that and say, yeah, that's why the guy was wanted by so many schools coming out of high school, because that's just a play where, again, you can't teach the ability to go and make that play. You can teach the ability to read it, to understand it, but the ability to close on that the way he did, to see the ball, to pursue the ball, and then to take off. That was a game-changing play. Washington State would have lost that game otherwise, most likely. The pick he had against Oregon State should have helped Washington State win that game. There were many other issues as to why they didn't win that game. I could go on about that for a few hours, but I think you saw him make plays throughout the season that were, okay, this is a little different. This is why this guy was regarded as well as he was. And then you saw him again. He'd make those adjustments. He'd make corrections. He'd get beat on a play. He wouldn't get beat on a play twice. He wouldn't get in his own head as much as maybe he did, especially early in his career. And he would be able to read those routes, especially on like the comeback routes, the short routes. He's able to read, and then he's so quick and he's so athletic, and he just has those skills that he can not just read the route, but he can get there, not to make a tackle necessarily, but to get the interception, knock the ball down, etc. So those type of plays were ones that, again, once he recognized what the play was going to be, he had the innate ability to where he could just go make the play. Whereas, there are a lot of guys who can know what's coming, but they can't get there in time.
Just looking at his counting stats, the 32 tackles, the 4 interceptions, as we've touched on, he had some pass breakups, but, diving into his pro football focus, some more analytic stuff, some things that stood out to me, only allowing catches on 52% of the passes that his receivers were targeted, NFL passer rating against right on 62. Another thing, his overall coverage grade, an 81. To put that in perspective, playing all those snaps, but an 81 grade on coverage. Miami last year had a cornerback, OJ Frederick, at 75. They had another guy who didn't play very much at 67, and those were the only two guys over 60. And certainly Miami has to improve their secondary. They have to replace a lot of players, which they're doing already with the transfer portal, like a guy like Ethan. But those stand out to me. And his last 5 games look like, again, PFF numbers look like he had a really good end of the season there on some of those marks. Jamey, as I touched on the beginning, I said, is Ethan O'Connor poised for a breakout year in 2025? And maybe it's stuff of the mindset stuff. And I know you touched on a little bit. You hopefully want to see that continue at Miami, the mindset he's shown with what he's seen already. But what do you think of his future, 2025, beyond, kind of how this thing goes for him? And what do you think is kind of next for him? And I know you touched on that weight, that strength, looking to improve on that. Like I said, listed at 172 right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd say he's listed at 172, and I mean, it's a skinny 172. He's 172 because he's 6'1". There is not a lot of, bulk on him. And again, like I said, you don't want your cornerbacks to be, bulky and clunky and slow. But I think he probably could. I mean, and I'm not going to pretend to be a strength coach. Maybe this is exactly what his weight needs to be for him to be as effective. I would think maybe a little more bulk would help him against those bigger receivers, but I think the mentality piece is the big one. I think he can't now get to Miami and said, "I'm at Miami, I'm that guy again. This is my world. I can do what I want." If he keeps the same killer instinct that he had at Wazoo, that work ethic, that kind of maturation, I mean, I think the sky's the limit for him. It's just a matter of, can he still do that? And I tend to think he can. I think he did certainly mature throughout the season, and just even from year 1 to year 2. As long as he can do all that, I don't see why he couldn't be certainly all conference, and even with his abilities and his coverage skills, I think could absolutely flirt with an All-American team.
It is so interesting hearing you talk about his mindset, because you obviously want to have confidence, but also there's a humility and the balance of both. I mean, we talk about this all the time. We've when you covered this sport for a long time, or sports in general, you're hearing all the players' journeys of how they kind of balance that, because you've got to have that mindset of being you don't want to lose confidence, but you've got to understand that there's always more work to be done. Jamey, you had an article, and I'm just, every time you mention his mindset, I always think about his uncle Jason David there. How much do you think that's played into it with his mindset? And if you could kind of share the type of player Jason was at Washington State. And I do want to mention this, and maybe this played a factor, I don't know, but Jason played in the NFL, and he played with some former Hurricanes, some big time names. For the Colts, he played with Reggie Wayne and Edgerrin James, and with the Saints, former Hurricanes, Jonathan Vilma, Jeremy Shockey. So I wonder if there's kind of some Miami just kind of telling them, because during that time when those guys were coming out of Miami, they had a lot of positive things to say about the U. Your thoughts on Jason David and maybe his impact, what you've seen, what you think his impact on Ethan has been.
Yeah, and I would say too, Jason does a lot of sports training and kind of working with athletes in that way, so he kind of knows the opportunities, and I would say he probably had something to do with saying, "Hey, this is a great opportunity for you." Not just from a development, I mean, from an NIL standpoint, I'm sure as well, but from a development standpoint, from an exposure standpoint, and so on. And I think Jason was. You certainly see similarities. I mean, Ethan is a lot bigger than Jason was. Jason was very small, 5'8", probably, but probably also outweighed Ethan by about 15, 20 pounds. But you do see some similarities, especially in their persona on the field. I mean, Jason David was renowned as a trash talker. I mean, there are people at Wazoo who say he is still the king of talking trash. And O'Connor has very much adopted a lot of that. Now, unless my memory fails me, he didn't get dinged for anything, for any unsportsmanlike penalties or any taunting penalties. But there were a few occasions like, all right, he's certainly talking, but I think he does it. He's smart enough with how he does it to where he's not just getting flagged all the time. So you definitely see those similarities. And most of my watching of Jason as a Coug comes off, old videos and so on. I mean, I was, 7, 8 years old when he was playing at Wazoo, so I knew the name, but I wasn't, necessarily studying his coverage abilities when I was that young. But there are some similarities, and I think you do see kind of where Jason's influence does come in for Ethan. And I think Jason had a big part in him coming to Washington State to begin with, and selling him and saying, "Hey, this is a good place to go to where you can start to build a career." And I would be fairly confident in saying he had something to do with him going to Miami. And it very well could be that he had those connections to his ex teammates that you mentioned. But I also think he probably is looking at it from a business standpoint, because he's a businessman through and through. And I think. It frustrated some Washington State people who thought, oh, let's see if we can get a hometown discount with Jason David's nephew, whereas Jason's, he's business. And what's the best business decision? It's, moving up a level, getting the exposure you get at Miami. Again, I'm sure capitalizing on a little bit more of a NIL payday, but I think there is definitely, you see some influence from Jason in watching Ethan.
Jamey, as I mentioned earlier, as I do every time we do these, just great stuff, great insight. I appreciate it just listening to you. I'm sure all of our fans, Miami fans, looking to gather more information on Ethan. So appreciate it. Keep up the good work at CougFan.com. And I urge everybody to check that out if you want to find out more about Washington State. So thanks again, Jamey.
Yep, anytime.